private ways for parties to settle disputes over externalities. One party or the other ends up paying to either cause the externality or to get rid of the externality. There's also policies that governments can do to get rid of externalities. So last chapter we talked about taxes, how they cause inefficiency and deadweight loss. They move the level of production away from equilibrium that the competitive market reaches. So because it was distortionary, we had this deadweight loss, and we had the problems associated with it. But externalities end up doing the same exact thing. They end up causing a deadweight loss. They end up causing an inefficient level of production, whether it's too low or too high. So if we figure out the taxes properly, we have the opposite effect from a tax or a subsidy. We can offset those externalities. So we can use something that moves the market out of equilibrium to move it back into equilibrium when there's something else moving it out of equilibrium. So if you had the right size tax, these two can cancel out, or can almost cancel out, and return us to that efficient level of production that we want. So remember, in equilibrium, that's the optimal level. It's the most efficiency we can get. So we're maximizing consumer and producer surplus. So both sides of transactions are as well off as possible, which is why economists keep trying to get there. Why we focus on getting there so much. So since utilities don't bear the total cost of pollution, that other people in society end up bearing the cost of pollution, they end up producing too much electricity, they end up producing too much pollution. So here we have what's going on in that market. We've got the marginal private cost for the tax and marginal social cost. So we're able, welcome to class. So here at the marginal social cost. So again, the cost is higher to society because the utilities aren't bearing the cost of the pollution. But if we add a tax on there, so a per unit tax like we talked about previously, if we get a high enough tax, we can move the private social cost, or the private cost of production up to the social cost of production. If we do that, then we end up with the efficient level of output. So in theory, if we can put on a tax that equals the social cost, the cost that these firms aren't bearing when they engage in production, we can get rid of the externality. We can get rid of the deadweight loss. We can move the economy back to this efficient level that we want it to be in. So if we do this, what's going to happen? The market price originally with the externality is going to be here. The efficient price paid by consumers when producers are taking into account the social cost of pollution is going to increase. It's going to be up here, where that social cost crosses the gain curve. You end up with lower quantity, the efficient quantity being produced when you take into account the externality, and you end up with a higher price being paid by consumers. But while consumers pay that higher price, we end up with a lower price being received by producers because they have to pay that tax. So the difference between these two, the efficient price and the price received by producers, is going to be the amount of that tax. To get that price, you just trace down from the quantity efficiency being produced, or the supply curve that takes into account the social cost, crosses the supply curve of the private cost for the firm. So that's the amount of tax imposed by government. So that's what the government is going to collect in taxes. And these taxes sometimes are used to offset the problems being created. Sometimes they're used for just general funding the government. That just kind of depends on the government, the people in there themselves. Yeah. So by increasing prices for consumers and by decreasing the prices received by producers, we end up with a lower quantity produced. So taxes can work to solve the problem of negative externalities because negative externalities cause too much to be produced. Because there's this overproduction, because the firms don't take into account the total social cost, you can do this. Year two.
Welcome to class. Thank you for the bonus point.
That's your third, yeah. At what point are you guys gonna really internalize the lesson of incentives and start working with each other to like show up late on different days so you all get bonus points?
I was just out there for, I mean, is there any penalty for being a little late?
People start doing that, there's gonna have to be.
Good question.
Yeah. See, that's like a practical real world example of how incentives work. How cost and benefits are gonna, when they change, it changes people's actions. Okay, so these taxes, what they do is reduce the amount of output. So it moves us back towards the efficient quantity. But when there's positive externalities, we've got the opposite thing going on. Too little is going to be produced. So we can't just tax people to make them produce more, because taxing makes them produce less. So that would just compound the problem. So instead of using taxes, what we can do is use subsidies. So we can pay producers or consumers to encourage the production or the consumption of a good. So that way we end up producing and consuming more. We move towards that efficient level. Because remember, people, when there's a positive externality, those involved in the transaction don't get all the benefits from the transaction. So they're going to consume, they're going to produce too little. They're not going to do as much as they would if they were able to obtain the entire benefit. So let's look at college education again. So individuals make decisions about whether or not to consume college, so to actually go to college and to learn. And when they decide that, or whether to go or not, it ends up creating a market price and a market quantity. Because we have, we use the market in the United States to determine the cost and how many people go to college. So obviously there's positive externalities from attending college. If other people are smart and make the decisions, and it makes you better off. Better productivity is good for you because you get goods cheaper. There's a lot of good things associated with college attendance. So this is an argument for a subsidy for college education. Make it easier and cheaper for people to go to college. More people go to college, society benefits more. There, before with the positive externality existing, here's E1 is a marginal private benefit. So this is what the benefit that people get from going to college. This curve B2 above it is marginal social benefit. So that's the benefit that society gets, the total benefit created from people attending college. And it's higher again because people aren't able to capture all the benefit of their college attendance. So we end up before the tax or before the subsidy with an equilibrium here, with market quantity and the market price, and the process that original marginal private benefit, so that original demand curve. So now if we added a subsidy, if we paid people to go to college, and the government paid colleges to make the price cheaper, that ends up moving up the demand curve. And if we put it at the right level, these subsidies at the right level, what we'll do is we'll end up moving that in line with the social benefit. So at this point, if you have this subsidy, you can get to the efficient equilibrium. So we end up increasing the quantity of people going to college, and we increase the price. So that's the price received by producers. The price paid by consumers is going to be the efficient price minus the subsidy. That's going to be the difference between these two. And to find where P is going to be in the graph, we just trace over from the marginal private benefit at the efficient quantity. So now by paying a subsidy to college students and potential college students, we end up increasing the level of college education. So more people are going to college. So we're able to move the private benefit in line with the social benefit. This is what we call internalizing the externalities. So the cost that people bear and the benefit that people bear by using these taxes and subsidies, internalize that externality. They're now forced to pay the cost, or they're now able to receive the benefit. All right, so economists love these so-called corrective taxes because they result in more efficient outcomes. Because they fix externalities. But we call these Pigouvian taxes and subsidies because the economist A.C. Pigou developed the idea over 100 years ago. Can you guys think of a problem with using Pigouvian taxes in the real world? Obviously, these things are very simple when you do them on a blackboard. But it can be tricky to actually implement these and design these in real life. So the main problem with trying to do these in real life is, remember, we don't know supply and demand curves in the real world. These are incredibly difficult or impossible for us to estimate in real time. Maybe looking back on the market from a couple years ago, like we talked about consumer surplus and the broadband internet access, that took economists, it was like several years later that they were able to estimate the demand curve. And they still don't know if that was correct or not, but they're pretty sure it was correct. So because of that, it's very difficult to figure out what level of taxation is going to be necessary and what will be the proper amount to move either the supply curve or the demand curve for private individuals, that private cost or private benefit, in line with the supply or demand curve for all of society. So because of that, we typically don't move when we use these Pigouvian taxes and subsidies. We don't move to that, what the social, optimal level would be. We end up moving in that direction. Maybe we overshoot it, maybe we undershoot it. Hopefully we end up closer than before that. So if you don't know the true value of an externality, you can say, oh, well, college education is a positive externality. But do we really know what the externality of a college education is going to be? How much is it really worth it to society for people to get college degrees? It makes it, or at that point, you're just guessing. So you can make it less efficient if you do overshoot. Most people agree that college education is good. More people getting a college education is good. But there's a lot of disagreement on how many additional people should go to college, what that optimal level is. So it can be very difficult to try to figure this out. And even within that, or despite that, the political process itself is imperfect. So Pigou, who came up with this idea, he talked about this a lot. He was a big fan of using it. He also noted the drawbacks to it. So he said, it's not sufficient to contrast the imperfect adjustments of private enterprise with the best adjustments economists in their studies can imagine. We cannot expect that any state authority will attain or even wholeheartedly seek that ideal. State authorities are liable alike to ignorance, to sectional pressure, to personal corruption by private interest. A loud voice, part of the constituents organized for votes, can easily outweigh the whole. So the basic idea is that you can't take problems with the market. So we know there's an externality. We don't know how much there is, but we know it's there. And we know whether it's positive or negative. We can't just say, all right, well, we can imagine the government doing this tax or this subsidy moves us to equilibrium. All right, we're done, and walk away. There's going to be problems no matter what our policy, whatever our choice, whatever our decision is. So we have to look at these imperfect actors, both in government and in the markets, and determine which one is less imperfect before we make a decision. So the name for that is the nirvana fallacy. So typically it's assuming that government policy has no cost, while assuming the market process does. That we see market failure, and a lot of economists follow this. We see market failure, we see externalities present, and we say, okay, well, easy, we'll just put a tax or subsidy on it and call it a day, without recognizing the problems going into that. Now we might think we have the perfect level of taxation, the perfect level of subsidy, but then once the political process gets involved and people have to compromise with each other, political parties become blinded by ideology and begin fighting with each other, you end up with a less well-designed tax or subsidy. There's also the other situation or you have those free market, evangelists that refuse to even consider government action. So they assume every market outcome is going to be perfect because, it's determined by the market. That's all there is to it. And then they look at the government and they see all these problems. But they don't take into account all the problems in the market. They don't take into account the externalities and the issues that results from it. So the key is to look at both to see what the problem with the externalities are. Are these large externalities? Are they small externalities? How well can we kind of estimate or have an idea of how big they are and how we can solve them? And then how difficult is the process going to be of designing an actual policy response, so a tax or a subsidy, that's going to move us to the efficient output, or at least close to the efficient output. Okay, so let's look at another real world example. Should be tax cigarettes and soda. So these are two very common excise taxes that we see. We typically call these sin taxes. Sin taxes are when you have something with a negative externality, a product or an action. So the government places a tax on them to reduce the consumption of these goods. So cigarettes and soda are two examples of sin taxes. Taxes on cigarettes have been with us for like 60, 70 years to try to reduce their usage. Soda is relatively newer. But both cigarettes and soda have negative health consequences, hence the term sin tax. But by itself, it's not sufficient to be negative externality. Just because you harm your own health doesn't mean you're hurting like other people. But since people's medical expenses are often shared with others, we use insurance to pay for a bulk of our medical care. And this is through either public or private insurance. So because of that, someone's poor health does end up costing other people around them. So we're going to expect there to be too much consumption of cigarettes and soda relative to what the efficient level would be if people were forced to bear the entire cost of consumption of those goods. So we expect that for consumption of cigarettes and soda, they're good candidates for good taxes. These are cases where if we increase the cost, we're going to decrease the consumption of these two goods. Move them more in line with what the efficient level of consumption would be. So in general, cigarettes are taxed more heavily than soda. There are much higher taxes on packets of cigarettes than there are like 2 liters of soda. So they ask, is this appropriate? So let's explore that. So here you have the market for soda. Here you have the marginal private benefit right here, the D1 curve. So the market outcome is going to produce at this quantity and at this market price. So the marginal social benefit is going to be this curve, D2 right here. So the efficient level of output is going to be much lower and at a lower price. So if we place a tax on the consumption of soda that's equal to the negative externality, so assuming we know these supply and demand curves, and we're able to accurately estimate the externality, move it in line, the marginal private benefit after the tax, in line with this D2 demand curve, so with the social benefit. What that ends up doing, we move the price, so the price received by producers is right here, so they're willing to produce this efficient quantity. The price paid by consumers is going to be above that. The difference between the price paid by consumers and received by producers will be equal to that tax that's placed on it. And again, the price paid by consumers is going to cross this marginal private benefit before the tax at the new efficient quantity. Okay, so they don't feel the need to talk about cigarettes. What's interesting about cigarettes is that we imagine that cigarette smoking has higher healthcare costs than the consumption of soda, and it would have like this negative externality. But it turns out that smokers end up dying earlier than non-smokers. Obviously, you end up with like lung problems, you end up with heart problems, other problems from a lifetime of smoking cigarettes. And the bulk of healthcare costs end up coming later in life. So it's like the end of life care that ends up costing the greatest amount of money for healthcare. So people, like smokers that die early, they pay into Medicare and Social Security, but they don't receive very many benefits. So there are these offsetting effects. Your textbook talks about this a little bit. Okay, this first thing, but the economist Viscusi, he talks a lot about death. He estimates the statistical value of human life based on the precautions and the safety measures they're willing to pay for. He says that the negative effects, the health consequences of smoking, are actually canceled out. The cost for society of those are canceled out by smokers tending to die early. So it may turn out, to answer the question from the previous slide, that cigarettes are overtaxed compared to soda. That soda consumption over a lifetime ends up causing more health problems that cause an externality than cigarette smoking actually does. It's like cigarette smoking causing worse health outcomes for those individuals because they end up dying earlier, so there's this lower external cost that other members of society have to pay for smoking. So now there are alternatives to using pecuniary taxes to solve externalities. Another traditional solution that governments use is called command and control. So basically the government imposes quantitative limits on the amount of pollution firms are allowed to emit, or they require firms to use specific devices or specific types of technology, different production methods in order to control the amount of pollution and to reduce the amount of pollution that's being released. So one example is that car manufacturers have to equip their cars with catalytic converters. It's done, again, to reduce pollution. It doesn't actually make the car, it's not necessary for the car to run. So there are problems. So what if there's several firms across the country? Let's say there's like all these utilities across the country that are generating electricity. But they end up, each one has very different costs of reducing pollution. So some use very clean methods, very clean fuels. So they're naturally going to produce like less pollution than places that use, like dirty coal. Or places that haven't installed scrubbers that reduce the amount of like CO2 that's let out. So it may not be efficient for all of them to reduce pollution by the same amount. Because some are operating as clean as possible, some are polluting quite a bit. Because of that, you're going to end up with a lot of waste if you try to make them all reduce by the same amount. So we can do this with less cost. Let's look at an example. So suppose Ford can reduce the pollution in its cars very cheaply. They have pretty inefficient cars that are emitting a lot of pollution. But GM has very high costs of reducing pollution. But for them, their cars are much more efficient already to begin with, so it will cost more and more to reduce pollution. So we want to achieve a certain level of pollution reduction. We say we want to cut carbon emissions by, say, 10%. It would be more efficient to ask Ford to reduce pollution more than GM, because it's a lot cheaper for Ford to do that than it is for GM to do it. Obviously, this doesn't seem fair to Ford. They're being held to a different standard. They're being forced to do more than GM is. So the efficient solution involves some sort of co-seam bargaining. Have Ford perform more pollution reduction than GM does, because it's much easier for them to do so. And then have GM compensate Ford for doing that. But because Ford's forced to do more pollution reduction than GM is, GM just pays for it. So both companies can be made better off, and we end up reducing pollution more than if we require both to reduce pollution by a moderate amount. So this basic idea is behind the old program called cap and trade. So basically, in cap and trade, the government established an allowable amount of emissions. They said, like, you're allowed to release this much this level of pollutants into the atmosphere. Once they set that level, they distribute permits to all the, I think it was just utilities in this case, all the utilities polluting. They all got these permits to allow them to release a certain amount into the atmosphere. Once they release these, they set up a market, so they allow firms to trade with each other. So firms with high costs of reducing pollutions are going to buy permits to pollute from firms with low costs of reducing pollutions. And those firms with low costs of reducing pollution are going to reduce their pollution, and they do so easily. Whereas the firms with a high cost are going to be able to reduce their pollution less. And when they do that, they do it at a much higher cost. So what we end up doing is reducing pollution at the lowest possible cost, or at a much lower cost than if we just force them all to reduce by, say, 10%. So what we've done here is we've taken a government regulation, and instead of using just a command and control policy, instead of treating everyone the same, forcing them to do certain things, we then allowed a market to operate within that. So underneath that regulatory framework, we have a market to determine who's able to reduce pollution the cheapest. And we end up with a much cheaper, much less expensive, let's say, way to reduce pollution to that same level that we would have. Anyway. So we did this in 1990 for sulfur dioxide emissions. So the improvements in pollution technology resulted once Congress established this cap and trade system. So the cost of compliance ended up being 90% less than initially estimated. And again, some of this is we set up a market in this case. So now firms have these incentives to move to increase, to improve technology, develop new technologies, to do this in a cheaper way. They're also trading with each other, so the ones that are able to do it at the lowest cost are able to do so. So we have the least level of economic disruption, and we're passing along the fewest possible costs to consumers. So now consumers don't have to deal with much higher energy prices in some areas where they were already operating relatively clean pollution-wise compared to other areas. So the program was very efficient with benefits at least 25 times the cost of implementing the program. It cost $870 million to meet Congress's goals. So this cap and trade program, setting it up for like Congress and everything, cost $870 million. If they would have used command and control, if they'd have just told everyone to reduce by, say, 10%, or whatever the reduction was, it would have ended up costing $7.4 billion. So $7.4 billion to $870 billion, that's a huge difference. Now, there's obviously a lot of criticisms of cap and trade, and they come from both the left and the right side of the aisle. So environmentalists object to it. They see it as giving a license to pollute, that places are able to pay to pollute to make the environment worse. But remember, pollution has a benefit because it allows cheap production. If we allowed no pollution, we wouldn't have any electricity. So it would make our lives a lot worse off. So there's some level of pollution that's acceptable to enable to give us a decent standard of living. And every production decision uses up some scarce resource. Sometimes these scarce resources are clean air, other times it's natural resources that go into the production process. Time is a big chunk. Every decision you make is time to produce, is time that you can't be using to do something else. So in this sense, paying to use the clean air seems appropriate. You pay to use our time, you pay to use natural resources. So it's just one more resource out there. It's important to remember the externalities associated with it. So if we destroy the environment, if we pollute the hell out of the air, and it makes life miserable for other people, for like everyone living in society, obviously that's awful and it's a serious cost. But at some level of pollution, we'll be able to live relatively pain-free, not deal with these terrible side effects of pollution, while at the same time having the things that make life possible to live and easier to live, better to live. Another concern is that cap and trade may produce hotspots. So there's locations where there's a lot of pollution taking place. So if we had firms with high costs of pollution that are located all close together. So say along one river, there's like 6 or 8 different electricity producers. These like utilities are all located there. If they all had high costs of pollution reduction, then they'd all keep polluting at a high level. They just buy the pollution allowances, the emission allowances, and then that area would end up heavily polluted. So the air around there would be, tough to breathe and be heavily polluted, whereas most of the rest of the country wouldn't have to deal with that. So there are some concerns about that. How likely it is debatable. I don't think as far as I know, I've never read like an analysis of cap and trade where they like showed this like really happening, but in theory you could see it happen. So why has cap and trade lost its popularity over the past 30 years? So cap and trade ends up altering who pays for the pollution. When pollution is unregulated, all consumers bear the consequences of pollution, but we don't have to actually pay for pollution. We don't deal out an actual dollar amount. So when cap and trade is enacted, the cost of pollution is borne directly by firms. So the firms engaged in production are the ones bearing the cost. Firms tend to be able to better organize lobbying efforts because they have a high cost themselves and there's a small number of them. It's easy for them to organize to get together and to begin lobbying Congress to get rid of these laws. Whereas the consumers feel the cost of pollution, they say here, diffusely. So a lot of people, like everyone else in the country, gets the benefit of less pollution, but it's a smaller per person amount than the polluting firms. So polluting firms can band together, they lobby the government, and it's easy for them, much easier for them to both organize and to actually lobby to get rid of these laws. This is one example of the special interest problem in politics. Small groups organize better than large groups, even if large groups can have a huge benefit from lobbying. This works not just for like environmental policy, it works for tariffs, where specific industries will get together and lobby in order to protect them from foreign competition, while all the rest of the consumers in society benefit from lower cost goods. We see this with tons of different policies. When there's a small group affected with a large gain, and then a large group of people affected with a smaller per person gain. All right. So turning back to the coronavirus, because that's all anyone can talk about now. There's a lot of actions that have positive or negative externalities that are amplified by the coronavirus. So what are some examples of these actions? And what are some of the different options we have to deal with them? So a big one is vaccines. So let's say they come out with a vaccine for coronavirus in a couple months. Because they're still in like stage 3 trials now. Obviously, taking the vaccine has a high positive social externality. It's not just does it protect you from the coronavirus, but the more people that have protection against it, the less likely it is to be transmitted from person to person. So if everyone or most people have the vaccine, we're not going to see it transmitted in like big gatherings like we do when everyone is susceptible to the virus. So because not every individual is going to bear the full benefit of being vaccinated for the coronavirus, we're likely to see a lower level of people than is optimal actually getting the vaccine. So what are some ways we can get around this? What are some ways we can solve this problem? Well, the first one is command and control. We have the government tell everyone to do it. That's going to be tough politically to do. I don't think there's ever been a Supreme Court case about it. So they'll probably go to the Supreme Court, and it'll take months until they figure that out.
Actually, they did that with like New York schools, where they had the vaccinated kids, refugees and stuff like that.
But that's to use government services, right? This would be like require them to, well, I guess if you're saying, well, no, because with coronavirus, it would be like you can't go to like the grocery store.
unvaccinated.
right? If you're unvaccinated, you can't go anywhere. I mean, they could say, like, if you want to go to school, the child and the parent has to be, or everyone in the house has to be vaccinated.
What would you say if you want?
That'll get most people. I'll probably get you up to the level. So that could work. There'll still be a lot of political opposition, but that, if you designed it that way, you probably wouldn't have the court challenge. Or you would have one, they would cite precedent and then be over.
Yeah.
Any other ideas? What's the quantity of people getting vaccines? We want more people to get vaccines. Is there a positive externality? So let's say we mostly pay attention to the quantity here. So if we want to move the private, let's go BP for private, and this for efficient. Get up there, what do? Subsidy. We want to move this in line with that. We give people a subsidy. So the government says, like, not only do you get this for free, but we'll pay you, I don't know, $50 or $100. Do you think that would work? I mean, in theory it would work. I don't know. Maybe people would be like, well, why do you have to pay me to do it? What's wrong with that? Think we could use cosine bargaining to figure this out? Something tells me no. Transaction costs are going to be super high because there's, what, 350 million Americans? Let's say they're split up 60-40. 60% say, like, you need a vaccine to go in public. 40% say no. One party compensate the other. There's too many people involved to try to work that out. So I think cosine bargaining is off the table. So we're basically left with pay people a subsidy and hope that doesn't turn them off from taking the vaccine, or command and control, so you have to if you want to use these government services. Tied to the next round of coronavirus stimulus. It's going to come out in like November, December.
Is that shit?
Not yet, but it's. Well, I think there's going to be a resurgence in like late fall and through the winter, like regular flu season, when we're all trapped inside. We'll be transmitting it to each other, so they're going to shut everything down again. I mean, it's just a bet, but that's when diseases get transmitted. We can also apply this to like social distancing. So like walking around with the coronavirus, or the chance of having the coronavirus, has a negative externality. You don't bear the full cost of that because you're infecting other people. You don't want to get infected yourself, but if you infect a stranger, it doesn't really cost you. So you're not going to take into account the full cost of your actions. People are going to, spend too much time outside the house. So we do command and control like we did, where we shut down a lot of places. Or we could try to do Peruvian taxes. I think that'd be a lot trickier. We could pay people to stay home. That might be easier than doing it the opposite way. I think cosine bargaining might be too hard. It might be easy to do in like a local level, or like a small town, but it'd be too difficult to do nationwide. So anytime we have actions with positive or negative externalities, we can use these three tools and look at which one's the best, which one's most likely to work, which one we have enough knowledge to make work. It's difficult to estimate the demand curve for like coronavirus vaccine, if and when it comes out, but we know the efficient quantity, like we need, based off the reproduction rate, based off the infection mortality rate, how many people we need to take the vaccine. So at least we have some decent knowledge, some more knowledge for a convenient subsidy for the vaccine than we typically do in the market. All right. Now we'll end class by looking at the 4 categories of goods, which might leak over a little bit into the next class before we start the review. So there's basically 4 main categories of goods that we're going to look at in this section. And we've seen that markets are better providing the efficient level of some goods and services than others. Some they're not, the markets aren't so good at, and we end up with these problems like with externalities. So the very important attributes of goods. So it's whether they're rival and excludable. And these are some of the characteristics that help determine how well a market functions at allocating these resources, or at providing the optimal level of output. So the idea of rivalry is a situation where one person's consuming of a unit of good means that no one else can consume it. So if I buy a hamburger and I eat it, like, you can't consume it. It's now gone. And excludability is a situation in which anyone who does not pay for a good cannot consume it. So again, that hamburger, I can prevent you from eating my hamburger. I can prevent you from using my phone. Most goods we think about are both rivalrous and excludable. So we call these private goods. So Big Mac, running shoes, products. When I use it, you can't use it, and I can prevent you from using it. Now, on the other hand, there's these things called public goods. These are the exact opposite. They're non-rivalrous, not excludable. So if I consume it, I don't reduce the amount of that good that's out there. Also, if I use it, I can't prevent you from also using it. So these are things like national defense. So once the country provides national defense, you have the military, defending our shores from foreign invaders. Me using that national defense doesn't reduce the amount that's available to you. And it's not excludable. Once they can't pick and choose which houses they're going to protect based on like who pays their taxes or not. Everyone ends up getting this protection. Another example, in theory, is the radio. So it's non-rivalrous. So if I listen to I'm like old school, like AM radio. If I listen to that, it doesn't reduce the amount of AM radio out there for you guys to listen to. So another person can listen to it. And it's not excludable. I can't prevent you from listening to my radio station. Because of the nature of public goods, it's very difficult or impossible for the market to actually provide these goods. There's 2 other types of goods. We'll focus on these less versus common resources. So it's like tuna in the ocean or like public pasture land. So they're rivalrous. So there's a limited number of resources there, limited amount, but it's not excludable. You can't prevent anyone from using those resources. And then there's quasi-public goods. So these are non-rivalrous. So my consumption of cable TV doesn't reduce the amount of cable TV that you guys can watch, but it's excludable. So you need to actually pay to get the wires hooked up to actually watch cable TV. So markets tend to be great at providing efficient levels of private goods because the person making decisions about how much to purchase tends to be the only one benefiting from the good. So only their preferences matter, only their needs, only their willingness and ability to pay. But markets aren't so good at providing efficient levels of other goods. So for public goods, people can what they call free ride. So they can enjoy the benefits for them without paying. So if you had a private firm trying to provide public goods, you would have a lot of people, because they're non-rivalrous and non-excludable, because they're not excludable, it's easy for them to use the good, they can't be prevented from using it, they're not going to pay for it. Obviously, why would you pay for something you can get for free? And looking at common resources, people have little incentive to conserve them, so they tend to be overconsumed. You hear about like overfishing in the oceans, because no one owns those resources. There's no incentive for the people to conserve them. All right, so look at the market demand for a private good. So basically what we do, if we want to make the market demand curve, is we just add together the quantity of goods demanded at each price by each consumer. So here we have Jill and we have Joe. So we put together the market demand, we just add these together. So the price of $1.50, Jill's going to demand 3 hamburgers. And the price of $1.50, Joe's going to demand 11 hamburgers. We add those together. The price of $1.50, this market, if it's just the two of them, will demand 11, 8 plus 3. Likewise, at the price of $4, Jill's going to want 2 hamburgers and Joe's going to want 4. Add 2 and 4 together, we get 6. So the price of $4 for the market, we end up with 6. Very simple, just adding together how much the participants in this market are willing to buy. Let's look at a public good. So to find the demand for a public good, we have to add up the price at which each consumer is willing to purchase each quantity of the good. So in the first panel, we have Jill willing to pay $8 an hour for a security guard to get 10 hours of protection. So the quantity of 10 hours, $8. In panel B, Joe is willing to pay $10 an hour to get 10 hours of protection. So this market for the public good for this security guard, for 10 hours of protection is going to be $18 this price. Let me add these together. Okay, so we're going to end there for class because it'll take too long to explain without going over.